you. I hope you appreciate the sort of a posed photograph of me staring meaningfully into the distance there. There you go. Wasn't my choice of image. So, hello, good morning. How are you feeling? Yeah? Good. That was about 5 people who managed to say great. The rest of you, I'm assuming you're just about still alive. How many of you are here at Poland IATEFL for the first time? A few of you? Yeah? I have a quick word of advice for you. If anyone recommends that you pop out for a quick drink in the evening, say no, okay? One thing I've learned at Poland IATEFL is that there is no such thing as a quick drink in the evening. But amazingly, I still managed to be here to talk to you this morning. So thank you all very much for managing to get out of bed and get yourself down here for the talk. What I'm going to be talking about today is something that I think we maybe don't talk about enough in language teaching, which is what we do and what we think about when we're thinking about planning lessons. And lesson planning is a strange area of what we do, because I'm guessing all of you, probably every day, spend at least a proportion of your time thinking about what you're going to be doing in the next class that you're teaching, yeah? But very, very rarely do you hear people talk about planning. I had a look through the rest of the conference programme, and there's nothing. You know, endless talks about 21st century skills, no talks about something we all do every day, which is planning lessons. And when I think about my own teaching career, and I go right back to the early years of when I was a young, raw teacher, as I said in my talk yesterday, I initially qualified, and I'm always embarrassed saying this in front of Polish teachers of English. My initial entry into the world of English language teaching was a 1-month IATEFL course. I know for a lot of you guys, you actually had to learn English first, as opposed to having been born speaking it by accident, like what happened to me. And you probably did some kind of pedagogical degree or something, but, you know, I was allowed to pretend I was a teacher after a 1-month course. And when I started out teaching, initially I was working in a private language school in London called St Giles Central. And I was working 30 hours a week. I was doing kind of six hours a day, 5 days a week. And at that point in my teaching career, because basically I had no idea what I was doing, I was sort of blagging my way through from day to day, I spent almost as many hours planning what I was going to be doing as I did actually teaching. I'd do my 6 hours, we'd probably go to the pub briefly. I'd come home and I'd sit there for 5-6 hours every evening, literally kind of writing out a script of what I was going to say and do in class the next day. And because I was also kind of young, raw, and a native speaker, I had no idea about language. I was terrified of the Italian kids I was teaching who knew about things like the subjunctive. And, you know, I've still no real idea what the subjunctive is supposed to be, but there are people out there who care about these things. And I was terrified about how I was going to deal with the present perfect simple in the next class. And so I'd go home and open the back of my course book and memorise the notes that told me we don't use the present perfect simple with a definite past time marker like yesterday. And I'd write it down on a bit of paper, and the next day in class when the Italian kids would ask me, why can't I say I've been there yesterday? I would say, oh, good question, Luciano. That's because we don't use the present perfect with a definite past time marker like yesterday. And they'd look at me like I actually knew something. And I'd survive for another week as a language teacher. And I guess for the first 2 or 3 years of my teaching career, what I was really trying to do was familiarise myself with probably just 1 or 2 course books. When I first started teaching, I didn't really have a choice on what course book I was using. Both in St Giles and then in my first overseas job working in Indonesia, I'd literally kind of walked into the job and the boss of the school I was working for just gave me a book. In Indonesia, an illegally photocopied book. And basically said, that's your course book, that's what you'll be using, start with Unit 1, you're on tomorrow. And as I kind of eased myself into language teaching, I worked out how to supplement the course book. I had my own copy of the course book. I'd make loads of little notes in it. I wrote all the answers in it. I'd make notes from the teacher's book and add them to various exercises. I started adding little post-it notes to the course book with supplementary exercises or games that I could use at various times. I developed my own kind of supplementary materials file for each level. When I was in Indonesia, I was using Headway, as many teachers of that generation did. You know, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of it. And I made my own kind of supplementary files for each one. So I'd say, okay, page 43 today. Oh, there's a song I can do. I'll just photocopy that from my magic file. And after 2 or 3 years, I felt like I could use those course books in a way that worked for me. And I think as a result of this, I was very, very reluctant to change. If the boss had come in and said, we're scrapping Headway, we're going to start on a new course book next week, this would have been like a nightmare for me, because it was 3 years of work that I'd put into familiarising myself with what I was doing. And the idea of actually changing that and starting afresh was something very scary, something that I was very resistant to. When I look back at the way I used to think about what I was doing in the classroom, and this is something I'll come back to as we go through, I think the real problem was the kind of priorities I was placing on my lesson planning and the way that I was thinking about what a lesson should be. Partly, I blame my CELTA course, my IATEFL course. I still have the book that I originally made notes from on my IATEFL course. And in the whole of a 1-month course, we did a 1-hour session in week 2 on lesson planning. And when I read back through my old notes on what I was told about lesson planning, it's a really bizarre kind of mishmash of information. So one thing I was told is balance. Make sure that you mix up the 4 skills, shift the focus around, keep things moving in the class. Make sure there's interaction. There should be links and themes that run through the lesson. I'm not quite sure that links and themes is the same as interaction, but there it is, sort of, you know, listed as things to think about from my CELTA course. I was then told, have a clear concept of aims. Even if those aims are completely insane, make sure you know what those aims are. I was then told as well, on top of that, elicit information. One of the kind of things that the CELTA did particularly at that point was, don't tell students what you can get them to tell you. Which seemed to mean, as far as I can remember, lots of time standing in front of classes kind of going, you know, like this, like a kind of strange human windmill or something, trying to sort of suck information out of the students with your arms. I was told model language first, which I'm looking back on it, I guess means a target grammatical sentence, probably, and then get students to repeat it, okay? You know, I've broken my leg. I've broken my leg. Everybody, I've broken my leg. Bring students to the meaning of language items. Yeah, come this way, come, it's over here. Look, here's the meaning, it's over here. Yeah, it means it happened at an indefinite point in the past. Ensure controlled and personalised practice. So again, the idea was that most of your lesson planning is basically going to be presenting grammar. Yeah, I think there's a kind of implicit suggestion there. Anticipate student problems, which is very difficult to do when you've never taught before and you don't know what kind of problems students are going to have. But, you know, I'd look at the back of the book and it would say, students often try and use the present perfect simple with a past time marker. And that would be me anticipating the problems. Plan stages and timing. I was referring to this yesterday, the kind of fictitious grasp of time that we all pretend to have when we're writing those lesson plans. You know, speaking, 7 minutes. Are you sure? Not 8, not 6? No, definitely 7 minutes, because that's all I've got left in the 60-minute lesson plan. And my favourite piece of CELTA advice, use props. You know, it's not enough to sort of become a bad actor in a classroom after 1 month, but you have to have a little bag of realia. Because there's nothing a CELTA course likes more than a little bit of realia. So that was basically the advice that I was given. And once I started teaching, this was kind of slowly driving me insane. As I said, I was teaching 6 hours a week, I was going home and spending 5 or 6 hours a day trying to get ready for what I was doing. And when I started at St Giles, I think they could see that, you know, I was quite driven and quite motivated, but clearly also quite sleep deprived and sort of slowly driving myself mad. So they assigned me a mentor. I was given this slightly older, sort of hard-bitten guy in the staff room who took me under his wing. And basically what he said to me is, "You're doing it all wrong. You can't spend your whole free time planning lessons. When are you ever going to come to the pub with the rest of us? What you need to do is learn how to do instant lesson planning." So I said, "How does one do this kind of instant lesson planning?" And he ripped a piece of paper out of a notepad and basically said, "Okay, so listen, it's Monday morning now, Monday afternoon. What did you do this morning?" So I said, "Well, I was doing the course book and we did a listening and some grammar and a bit of speaking." And he said, "Okay, look, so this afternoon you do a reading, do some vocab, do some speaking. Okay, tomorrow, yeah, you can do another listening, bit more grammar, some speaking. Next afternoon, reading, revise the grammar." They love that, the students. You can never revise the grammar enough. "Photocopy a game or something, or there might be a song with the grammar in it that you can do." And then basically you just keep going like that, okay? Friday, revision, leave a big question mark there because you might think of something to do, probably a song, maybe show them a video of 40 Towers or something. You can do more of that kind of thing in the afternoon, and then we'll be in the Crown on the corner of New Oxford Street from 4 o'clock. And that was basically my induction into the secret mysteries of instant lesson planning. And I would just kind of look at the book I was going to be using, and I'd kind of chop and change, and I'd start with page 42 and do a little bit from there, and then I'd jump to page 53, and then I'd go back to page 17 and sort of mix it all up. And I think basically that's how the path was made for me in the early years of my teaching career. Basically, I had this feeling that as a teacher, I couldn't just pick up the course book at page 1 and start with exercise 1 and follow it with exercise 2. God forbid that you do anything like that. That was seen as being boring, that was seen as, you know, not mixing it up, not kind of chopping and changing enough. And so I got into this habit of chopping and changing the course book out of a kind of subconscious fear of being seen as boring. Working through a course book was seen as somehow sort of antithetical to student-centred learning. I didn't know what that really meant, but I knew that it didn't mean working through a course book from exercise 1 to exercise 10. I think the problem with all of this, okay, and I think this kind of discourse is still quite prevalent in language teaching. There's a sort of discourse about course book use, there's a discourse about, you know, you can't just take the book in and use it and work from exercises 1 to 10. That's not student-centred. And as a result, I think, as teachers, we often chop and change what we're doing with lessons. My worry about this, I guess, is it reduces discussion about what we actually do when we use course books. As a writer, I watch lots of teachers use my own material. And it's really fascinating because you can watch 10 teachers teach the same double page and you see 10 insanely different lessons. The idea that somehow a course book forces conformity and, you know, kind of standardisation on teachers, I think is a real myth, because teachers do very different things. You watch 10 teachers just do something simple, like go through a vocabulary exercise. Some teachers just check the answers. Some teachers ask all kinds of extra questions. Some teachers ask personal questions as they're checking the answers. Some teachers, like I was talking about yesterday, ask questions about the language as they're going through. Some teachers do a lot of feedback on the student speaking, some teachers don't. So part of the problem, I think, is by just saying course books for standardisation, we close down a discussion on what we're doing while we're using course books. And personally, I think people like Scott Thornbury, with his kind of rabidly anti-course book diatribes, have led to that kind of closing down of discussion about what we do as teachers in the classroom every day. I think another thing that's to blame is one of my favourite IATEFL acronyms. We work in a profession that has millions of different acronyms, yeah? I don't know if you've ever encountered the acronym ARSE. Jim Scrivener is responsible for the ARSE acronym, and ARSE basically means adapt, reject and supplement. I'm not sure if it was just a subtle in-joke on his part when he thought of this acronym, or if he really didn't bother saying it aloud to himself. But what you notice a lot of the time when you're working with teachers is there's a lot of arsing around. And sometimes when I'm talking to teachers about why did you decide to do a warmer before exercise 1 and then start with exercise 7 and then go back to exercise 1, which is basically a warmer, I'm interested in what your thinking was when you were planning this lesson. Listen, right, Jim Scrivener told us that what we should do is adapt, reject and supplement, and that's what I was doing. And I think a lot of teachers, myself certainly as a younger teacher, use this kind of notion to justify chopping and changing and messing around with what we're doing in a course book. And these ideas, I think, are reiterated in a lot of the literature. Possibly, like many of you, the first real book about English language teaching I read was Jeremy Harmer's The Practice of English Language Teaching. I read the 1991 third edition, and I've still got a copy of it at home, and when I was putting this talk together, I went back and just had a look at what he has to say about planning. And it's quite interesting because it obviously echoes a lot of these sentiments. So one of the things he says is, teachers who overuse a textbook and thus repeatedly follow the sequence in each unit may become boring. I mean, you know, you can become boring whatever you're doing in a classroom. Over a period of time, you teach the same types of activities in the same order. The cornerstone of good planning is variety to offset this tendency. Okay? You can't just start at exercise 1 and go on to exercise 2. Each class needs to be treated differently, said a man who wasn't teaching 30 hours a week at this point of his career. Nowhere is this more true than in planning. You've got to select the activities that are ideal for your own particular students, because you're a mind reader who can collectively tell what all 18 of them secretly most want to spend their time doing in class. He then says, if new language is to be introduced, we will list some or all of the models on a formal plan. So again, there's this assumption that really what we're doing as teachers is planning how to present grammar. And it's reiterated. We can anticipate the new language for a presentation that may cause problems because of the form. The introduction of the past simple can cause problems because of the endings, question forms, etc. So again, there's this assumption that basically most lesson planning is about PPP. It's about thinking about the structure you're going to present, how you're going to concept check it, how you're going to do your control practice, how you're going to produce it. That's what's driving the car. Jim Scrivener was the second book I read about language teaching. I read Learning Teaching. And the advice there is even weirder, even vaguer when it comes to planning. So Jim says, you need to think about the learners. Will they enjoy doing the lesson? Well, I hope so, Jim, because I need the job. You know, I can't think of anything else I'm going to do. Will they benefit from it? Well, that's the goal. You know, fingers crossed, eh? The aims, what will they achieve? What are you hoping to achieve yourself? You know, survival and being avoiding being asked about the subjunctive was my main aim at this stage. The teaching point. What is the subject of the lesson? The skill or language area to be studied? What topics are you going to deal with? Page 42 of Headway, Jim. That's what I'm doing. What activities will you use? What sequence will they come in? What texts, tapes, back in the old days, pictures, exercises will you use? What will you say? Make sure you write it down in great detail so you can memorise your script. How will the seating be arranged? How much time will each stage take? 7 minutes, Jim. You know, so many questions and so few answers provided for the nervous young teacher who wasn't sure what they were doing when lesson planning. And I think for me, what basically started to happen was planning lessons basically meant planning a string or a sequence of activities, okay? I basically came to see classes as strings of things to do. If you'd sat me down in my 3rd year of teaching and asked me, so what are you doing in your class today? The way I would have understood this question was to say something like, well, first, I'm going to do a revision game from this wonderful book, 5-Minute Warmers. Then I'm going to do a presentation of the present perfect simple. Then I'm going to do a illegally photocopied page of Raymond Murphy's English Grammar and Usage Controlled Practice. Then we're going to do a grammar game where students walk around saying, haven't I met you somewhere before? Then I'm going to probably correct all of the grammar mistakes, and then I'm going to give them another photocopied page for homework. And, you know, maybe we'll do a song. I've been to paradise, but I've never been to me. Because that's got 42 examples of the present perfect in it, even though I hate it. So that was basically the way that I came to see things. And I think the way that I supplemented, the way that I brought in extra material was both around grammar. I kept kind of bringing in extra grammar activities and games and exercises, and around the topic. So I'd think, okay, we're doing something on sport, I better bring in extra vocab, extra reading, something else on the topic. And I think the questions that I asked myself when I was thinking about what I was doing were basically, how can I do extra grammar practice to what's in the book? Because, you know, we've done the present perfect simple, but they still make mistakes with it. So I better do more practice. Can I add extra vocabulary? Because I think often I had this feeling that they kind of knew half of the words already in the book. So if I could find some really difficult extra vocabulary on the topic to hit them with, it would keep them in their place and show them who the boss was. And then I had this feeling of, you know, is there some kind of fun, chatty, wacky, communicative, fun sort of game thing that I could squeeze in somewhere? Ideally, to do a bit more grammar practice. And I think at this stage, all of my practice was underpinned by some beliefs that I wasn't consciously aware of, okay? Looking back on it now, I can see that what was driving this way of thinking was a particular kind of mindset, but at that time I wasn't able to articulate this mindset. And basically driving this idea was this belief, this fallacy, I think, this myth, that really accurate production of grammar would somehow be mastered by further massed practice. So I'd do my present perfect lesson, they'd make mistakes, I'd do another present perfect lesson, they'd still make mistakes, and yeah, you can continue forever like this, basically. But I believe that, you know, just because we'd done 5 hours and they were making mistakes, that was a good argument for doing 5 more hours on this particular grammar structure. I guess I used to believe that with vocabulary, it was more important to kind of skim over a lot of language than to go in depth into the language that I was actually looking at on the page. I was kind of doing less with more rather than doing more with less, if you like. Particularly because of a CELTA course, I had this belief that lessons had to be fun. You know, you had to kind of bounce around like Tigger, and students have to kind of laugh a lot, and you know, I think it's very much the result of teaching people who've only had a month's training how to be language teachers. This idea that, you know, language classes have to be like a kind of holiday camp or Butlins or something, and you're the animator. And I guess I also believe that speaking, to be honest, almost any kind of speaking was an end in itself. And what this often meant was completely deranged speaking, in the name of grammar practice. One of the ones I remember, to my great shame, spending a lot of time doing, was a game from Keep Talking by Friedrich Klippel. And the game was called Pizza or Paris. Okay, and the goal was to practice comparatives, and you split the class into two groups, Group A, Group B. You have two hot seats at the front. You have a bag with a whole load of random nouns, and you say, okay, come up to the front, take a card. You've got pizza, you've got Paris. You've got 1 minute to explain why pizza is better than Paris using comparatives. Every correct comparative, you get 1 point. And you're sitting there going, pizza better than Paris? Yeah, 1 minute starting now. If you're hungry, pizza is nicer to eat than Paris. 1 point. Paris is more difficult to eat than pizza. Good, 1 point. You've got 1 minute to talk about Paris. Why is it better than pizza? If you want, it's more romantic to spend a weekend in Paris than to spend a weekend in a pizza. You know, you wonder why students struggle to transfer their grammar knowledge from the classroom to the real world. But I thought, you know, hey, they're doing loads of speaking, they're having loads of fun. They've used 84 comparatives in 12 minutes. We must be doing something right. Now, maybe when you've heard me talk about this stage of my teaching journey, you recognise a few echoes of your own path. I think these kinds of journeys through thinking about what we're doing, I'm hoping are not exclusive to me. I'm hoping that, you know, for some of you, you'll be thinking, oh yeah, been there, done that, been through that kind of problem. In the end, I guess, I got to a stage where I started to rethink what a lesson should be and what a lesson should do. And one of the things that made me really start to rethink it, in a sense, was becoming a coursebook writer. Once I started writing my own lessons, you have to kind of start really thinking about, well, what is it I'm actually trying to do here? What's the point of what I'm doing? And the Common European Framework, I think, is a very sensible place to begin by thinking about the objectives that we're bringing to the classroom. Because they basically say that the goals of language teaching, any language teaching, should be threefold. What we should be doing in the class is helping students to deal with the business of everyday life, helping students to exchange thoughts, feelings, ideas, opinions and experiences, helping students to broaden their understanding of different ways of thinking and different cultures. And I think these are useful filters for us as teachers to look at the material that we're teaching. If you're looking at a lesson in whatever book it is you're using, it's good to ask yourself, I think, does this lesson help me help my students exchange ideas, thoughts, feelings and opinions? Does it help them deal with the business of everyday life? Does it develop their understanding of different cultures? Or does it just ask them to imagine that they're weird stalkers standing outside an apartment block using the present continuous in slightly creepy ways by saying, he is doing his homework, they are eating dinner, she is having a shower? I mean, lots of course books are full of those kinds of exercises. And I think we need to ask ourselves, is this helping the students achieve these kinds of goals? When I was working with Pearson on the Roadmap series, Pearson have the Pearson Global Scale of English, which is basically expanding on and consolidating what the Common European Framework's doing. It's a way of trying to give both writers and teachers, I think, a framework for thinking about real-world outcomes that you can work towards at different levels, giving you some kind of support in clarifying the goals that you can be working towards. So, what all this led me to was when we were starting to work on the B1 plus level, which was the first one we wrote, was just looking at what the goals were and thinking about, okay, if this is a sensible goal, how does one structure a lesson around this? So for example, you know, goals were things like, at B1+, students can express opinions and react to practical suggestions of where to go, what to do. Do you fancy popping out for a quick drink? Yeah, that's a good idea. Where do you want to go? Well, there's a bar just round the corner that's open till 2. Okay, that sounds great. You know, those kind of conversations. Teaches you how to make complaints. Teaches you how to speak in general terms about environmental problems. Very topical after yesterday. Discuss the main points about news stories, about familiar topics. Give a short rehearsed talk or presentation on a familiar topic, such as I am doing now. And, you know, make excuses about using a range of polite forms. And all of these, I think, are quite sensible things for students to try to learn to do. They also pose a challenge to you as a teacher, as a writer, in terms of thinking about, if that's a sensible destination, how do I help my students get there? Okay? There's also some key ideas that I think emerge from looking at these kinds of goals. One is that when we're teaching, the communicative goal should be the primary thing that drives our lesson. Not grammar, not vocabulary. I think a lot of my early teaching, it was always the grammar that drove the lesson. The speaking that we did was essentially any kind of random wacko conversations using the grammar. Pizzas or Paris, haven't I met you somewhere before? With this way of thinking about lesson planning, it's not saying you don't need grammar, it's not saying you don't need vocabulary, it's saying that yes, that's fine, but first you need to be thinking about what's the goal, what's the destination, and then thinking about how can we look at how grammar and vocabulary interact within these kinds of conversations or within these genres of writing to help students achieve these particular communicative goals. Interestingly, in both the GSE and the Common European Framework, there's quite a lot of emphasis placed on fixed phrases, on patterns, which obviously includes grammar, but is broader than just the traditional way of thinking about grammar, and on routine, you know, just predictable, normal, everyday, familiar kinds of things. There's also an emphasis on going deeper, going into more depth with what you know already, doing more with less, in a way, I think. And there's an emphasis on general topics and the familiar. Because, you know, a lot of the time in everyday life, we talk about the same things over and over again. You think about what percentage of your conversations in your daily week are about things like work, food, shopping, free time, you know, family. That's 95% of what you talk about every week, probably. And then maybe you have 5% where you have a kind of random, unusual conversation that you haven't had before. But a lot of what we do and a lot of the way we become competent is through repeated practice of the familiar, of the routine. So what this led us to is a concept called backwards planning, okay? I first encountered this idea of backwards planning when I was reading about American high school syllabus design from sort of outside the ELT field. In the 2000s, they overhauled the American high school system and they tried to work out ways of making input much more closely related to the desired goals or the desired outcomes. And basically what it means is when you're planning your lesson, you start by deciding where it is you want your students to get to, okay? What is it you want them to be better able to do at the end of the lesson? And for me now, when I'm working with teachers and we're talking about lesson planning, this is my first question. You know, what is it you're going to do today? Well, I'm going to do a song and then a page. No. I'm not interested in the sequence of activities you're doing. I'm interested in what goal is it you're trying to achieve with your students? What is the destination, the end point of this particular lesson? Then what you do, I think, is you imagine the actual conversations that students at this level might be able to understand, might be able to have. You write them. You think about, okay, if I was trying to make a complaint in a restaurant as a B1+ level student, what would I say? What language would that involve? Who would I be talking to? Why would I say the things I'm going to say? You choose, or you write, some kind of realistic models. And again, I think, As a younger teacher, I didn't think very much about the way in which the input I was giving students led to the kinds of conversations they might want to have. Despite the fact that as a language learner, when I was living in Indonesia, I mean, almost all of the input that I received was directly related to my output. The reason I became fairly competent at conversational Indonesian was because I wasn't having to listen to 10-minute listenings about a French man who ate an aeroplane. Or I wasn't having to listen to an imaginary pop star talking about her backstage demands using a range of different quantifiers. I was just having normal conversations and repeating normal conversations. Once you've got your models, you then break them down, you start looking at them, you analyse them, you think about what goes into them, you think about how they work, and then once you've done that, you can be concrete about the actual language that you think is worth looking at that will be new for students or potentially new for students at this level. And often, this doesn't just mean a lexical set, 10 kinds of fruit, 5 ways of laughing, because that doesn't necessarily lead to a particularly sensible communicative outcome. It doesn't just mean, now we're going to do this particular piece of grammar. It means thinking about how whatever grammar you're going to be looking at feeds into what students are going to be asked to try to do at the end of the lesson. It means thinking about chunks, collocations, thinking about the role of the listener and the kinds of things the listener might be saying in these particular kinds of conversations, and with written models, written lessons, thinking about text structure and sort of generic features. Finally, it means sitting down and writing the exercises that guide the students towards a place where they're able to start to do the kinds of things you want them to do at the end of the lesson. Click, click. And then you kind of build back up towards the final task, yeah? So by knowing where it is you want to end up, it's much easier to construct the road that leads you to that particular destination. In a way, you can't build the road if you don't know where it is you want to end up. So, just to give out a quick example of what this might mean, this is from Unit 8B of the B1 Plus level that I co-authored with Andrew Walkley. And it's about relationships. You start off with, okay, in this lesson we want to help students get better at talking about different relationships. The grammar's a slightly sort of oddball, curveball piece of grammar, whoever, wherever, whatever, whenever. There's going to be some vocabulary for talking about character, but basically what we're trying to do is help the students have this particular kind of conversation. This is the end point of where we want the students to get to. We want them to list a bunch of people, okay, write down some people that you're close to, take turns interviewing each other, use some of the questions below. Who's this person? Did you get on okay? How come? What happened? Do you see much of each other? Try to use some of the grammar in your answers. If you can, you can. If you can't, you can't. It's not the end of the world. But it's nice to have a try. So by knowing, okay, this is where we want the students to get to, this is the conversation we want them to have at the end, it then helps us to kind of start by thinking, how can we guide them there? So I think with any lesson, a good place to start is always with the students in the room. Start from them, start by seeing what they can do already. So they've got these pictures, which relationships are shown in the pictures, which of the relationships do you have? How important are they to you? What's more important for you, family or friends? Why? They listen to 4 short conversations, which are very similar to the conversations they're asked to have themselves at the end of the lesson. Which relationships do they discuss? Sister and sister, or sister and brother, mother-daughter, mother-son, boss and worker. There's a second listening, which brings out some of the vocabulary. Some of it's things the listeners say, some of it's things the main speaker says. He's a really bright kid. I tried to be a bit strict. Oh, she's so cute. Oh, that's generous of them. There's then a little discussion, so that students have space to respond to what they've heard. How good are the relationships that you heard about? They get on well, they don't get on very well. It's kind of added comprehension check. Students may disagree about their interpretation of what they've heard. Out out of this, you then have the grammar. The grammar comes out of the conversations that they've heard. So it's things like, I just can't control him. He just does whatever he wants. I've tried moving him around, but whoever he sits next to, he ends up arguing with them. He says hi whenever I see them, whenever I see him. There's a kind of guided discovery, so students think a little bit about the grammar that they're looking at. They're kind of led to their own conclusions about how the grammar works. The grammar practice is, again, very much in the context of thinking about conversations about people you know. So again, it's things like, wherever you are in the world, you can always find people you get on with. You should always try to stay together, whatever happens. They have a little discussion about these. They write their own advice sentences about how to manage relationships. They do all of this. The vocab, again, is thinking about language which may be new for students at this level, presented in fully grammaticalised sentences, so students see how the vocab interacts with grammar. They see some of the other language that you often use with the vocab that you're looking at. She's very reliable, always willing to help if I need it. She can also be very funny in meetings. She's really bright. She's one of those people who gets top marks without even trying. So they do all of this. There's some questions about the language that generates more connected language, a bit like I was talking about yesterday at the end of my talk. Things like, what can you do to stay calm? What might you do if you're politically active? Why might kids be nasty to each other? So they're not directly personal questions, but they're questions that draw on students' world experience, draw on students' life experience. And then, finally, you're at the speaking, okay? You have another little model. You're going to hear people talking about people they know. Listen, who are they talking about? What's the person like? Then you write your list, you think about who you're going to talk about, and then you do the task. And as a writer, it's basically thinking about, if this is where I want to get to, if this is what I think a kind of sensible, desirable, real-world goal is, how can I structure the lesson in such a way that there's a range of inputs? They do some speaking, they do some listening, they do some grammar, they do some vocab, but in such a way that it all leads towards a final outcome. And I think as a teacher, if you have these kind of communicative outcomes, if you have these kind of conversations at the end, they're much easier to recycle. In the old days, when I would say, doing the present perfect, it's really, really difficult to say you've done the present perfect. Maybe your students can use the present perfect to walk around and say, haven't I met you somewhere before? Have you ever been to Spain? When were you there? Maybe they can learn to use the present perfect in that context. But to say they've done the present perfect, well, what? You now think they can use it in every possible context they might want to use it in. They can say things like, have you tried turning it off and turning it on again? They can say things like, unemployment has gone up 15% since the last election. Probably not. So I think when you're thinking about the end point of the lesson, not as being complete mastery of a particular grammatical structure, but instead you're thinking about the end point of the lesson as being the ability to have, to a certain level of competence, a particular kind of conversation, it's much easier to test that and it's much easier to recycle that. If your goal is the present perfect, how do you recycle it next lesson? What do you do apart from another controlled practice activity or another random free practice activity? If your goal is have conversations about relationships and people you know, you do the lesson, you do the feedback, you do the input. Students can go home, they can record themselves for homework, talking about people they know. They can use some of the language from the page. You can ask them to write out a conversation between two people, talking about someone they thought of. You can give feedback based on their attempts to do those particular kinds of tasks. Next lesson, you can say, okay, let's see how good you are at doing that conversation again. We've done it already. Yeah, I know, you didn't do it very well though. Do you remember all the feedback I gave you? Have a quick look at it. This time, try and do it better. Stand up, talk to someone different, but have the same conversation. And just doing that, I think, just being able to have a conversation you've already had with a different interlocutor is really, really important. Because you basically know what you're going to say, you've no idea what they're going to say. They may ask questions which take you off in a slightly different direction. They may tell you stories which take you and them off in a slightly different direction. So you've still got your structure, you've still got your your route towards the desired outcome, but it also allows you space to diverge and go off in different directions. The lesson I showed you is taken from the new 8-level Pearson General English Series roadmap, which is available out on the Pearson stand. Please do have a look. If any of you want to get in touch, or you want copies of the presentation or anything, you can get me at hugh@lexicallab.com. I also co-run a website called www.lexicallab.com. We run summer courses for teachers and language students, teacher development, language development courses. And I'm on Facebook for my sins. Thank you all very much for your time and for your attention. Before we wrap up, does anyone have anything you wanted to ask, or any questions or anything? Blimey. I'm a cocaine addict. You get your energy from the room. You know, same as any teacher, you get your energy from the room. If you go into a room half dead, you're going to have a half dead bunch of students. If you go into a room and give energy, you get energy back. It's like a virtuous circle. Yeah? Yeah, so I'm doing a live lesson now, apparently. I'm not really sure what I'm actually doing, but I know I'm doing a live lesson. It's a make it up as you go along sort of live lesson. I believe so, yeah. Yeah? Thank you.